Welcome to Goldfish on Games, where today we're looking at one of the problem childs of my collection. So we're going to be fixing up, modifying, and then doing a bit of spring cleaning with my Pentium 3. The goal of this episode will be to strip down the machine, replace what isn't working, and then move it to a new case, all while checking out the chosen hardware and then finally doing a fresh OS install. So, what's been done so far? Well, all the cards have been taken out, so this motherboard is free to be removed. Now this is an OEM compact board, and it's using the Intel 815 chipset, which was seen as pretty decent. But this board has issues. Provide it with power and it will instantly start up without any button being pressed, which in itself wouldn't be so bad, but it doesn't even post when it starts up. Now I've tried a few things to fix it up, but I didn't really get anywhere with it, so my current solution is to switch to this. Now this is the DFI CA61, which is sporting the VIA Apollo Pro 133 chipset, which seems to have a few mixed reviews, but overall doesn't seem too bad. And if we check them out side to side, we can see it has more PCI as well as some ISA slots, which is quite useful. And it also doesn't have any onboard sound or graphics, which I had to make sure I disabled on the old compact board as it would conflict. The processor is under this modern heatsink and fan, which is pretty cool that you can buy brand new heatsinks for the Socket 370 form factor. And the processor is a 1 GHz copper mine with a 133 frontside bus. This sits quite nicely between my 200 MHz Pentium 1 and the 2.8 GHz Pentium 4. Now there are jumpers on this new board, which set the multiplier, but when I tested this out they didn't really seem to do anything, so we can just leave them alone. So with the CPU in place and the heatsink attached, let's take a look at the case that this is going into, which long-time viewers will recognise is the one I actually use for my main PC, as it is a really nice case and I'm not one to let parts go to waste. And all I've really done to this so far is to give it a good clean down, as I've had this for over a decade, and it got a little bit dusty inside, and some of that metalwork needed a really good wipe down. I also took this opportunity to replace the case fans. Now a neat touch is the whole motherboard tray will just pull out so you can work on the core of the machine quite easily, which also makes it easier to replace that final case fan with some nice Noctura fans, as the old ones were, well, a little caked in dust, which surprisingly doesn't actually need any screws to hold it into place. Instead you push through these little plastic tabs, then you put these plungers through the middle to hold it into place. And with that done, let's put on the back I/O panel, which isn't exactly the right one, but it's close enough so that should be fine. And this can only mean it's time for a Mobo screwing montage. I'm going to quickly hook up the case fan next, as well that header sits right under the graphics card, and then we can get onto the RAM, which is 2 sticks at 256 MB, which are both PC 133 spec. Now this will max out the Windows 98's technical limit of 512 MB, though you can go past that with patches, but for the games I've got planned, we don't really need that. And with those in place, I guess it's time to move on to the cards that will be used. And first up is the primary graphics card, which is an MSI GeForce 4 4200 Ti. It's got 64 MB of RAM on board, and this is the AGP card. Now this could be seen as being possibly a little over-spec'd for this machine, seeing it was released at a time where you could get a 2.4 GHz Pentium 4. Something like a GeForce 3 might be more in keeping, but to be honest I actually had a similar card back in the day, so I'm happy with it being able to push any game that I might want to throw at the machine. Next up is sound, which I feel my choice might seem a little odd to most, but it's this cheap Sweex SC012 PCI sound card, Now this was actually bought brand new in 2017, and amazingly for such a modern sound card it does have Windows 98 drivers. They were not supplied on the CD, but they were found on the driver site. So you might be asking, why this card? Well, I wanted something really nice and small, as the previous machine, well, it sat right next to that graphics card fan, so I wanted something that would give it a bit more airflow. And with this being a pure Win98 machine, it doesn't really need DOS support. But there is a plan to upgrade this, as I have this nice other card that I want to try out. But first of all, I need to get this machine set up and running, so I can do a whole video just on it. And with this in place, and that CD audio cable connected, let's move on to the next card, which is this ISA network card. Again, this might seem like an odd choice, but it will make sense in just a minute. With the old machine, I was actually using a USB network dongle, as it didn't have enough slots for a network card, so this really shouldn't be that much slower than the other solution. And as a bonus, it doesn't require any additional drivers, so it should be pretty easy to set up. And seeing there's lots of space left, I think you can guess there's something else coming. And that's not one, but two Voodoo 2 cards. These I believe are the 8MB models, but we'll have to check that once we get into Windows. Now these might seem a little old for the machine, as a top-end Voodoo 3 or 5 would be a much better match. But seeing how much they can cost, I'll stick to the cards I already had to hand. Now this setup gives me a nice middle ground that I can run many of the later Glide games quite nicely, as well as having that primary card for all the other games. And with those two cards inserted, we add the SLI cable to join them up. And then because these are 3D only cards, we still need to use the pass-through cable to join the GF4 to the Voodoos. Now as you might see, I'm trying my best to make sure everything's nicely spaced out, as I don't want anything to overheat or to push heat onto other parts. So it might look like a bit of a weird layout, but there is some reason to the madness. And before we put the tray back into the case, let's look at that front panel, which is made much easier by this detached connector block, and then made much harder due to the Voodoo 2 cards being over the pins. I probably should have done this earlier. Now there is one oddity with this board, there's no power LED. The closest thing I found was this G LED, that according to the manual that I found online is meant to show when the machine is sleeping, not when it's on. I'm not sure if this will actually work as a power light as well, and trying it out isn't exactly simple, as it's got this 2-pin connector, and the header, well, it's 3 pins. So using this quick connector we can actually get it hooked up, and then, well, I'd like to say there's a 50-50 chance I've got this right, but I think we all know the odds aren't really that good. And with all that done, let's turn our attention to the case. First up is the power supply, which is this new old stock model that I got a year or so back. It's just 400 watts, but it provides all the power that's needed, as it has 40 amps on the 5V rails, which is particularly needed for that GeForce 4 as well as the Voodoo cards. It would have been nice to use a modern supply, but they've pushed most of that power on the 12V rails, which really isn't useful for this build. Now one thing we've not talked about so far is storage, and seeing that most of the games of this era came on CD or later DVD with some of the re-releases, I'm going to be using this DVD reader for the optical drive. It's nothing special, but it does the job. So let's slide the motherboard into place and screw it in, and then start looking at hooking up that power supply and the DVD drive. And with everything hooked up, it's time to start looking at what we're going to be using for the main drive. The previous setup was using this, an SD to IDE converter with a 32GB card. Now I'm not going to be using this, as during testing it just corrupted the file system, not once but twice, and that was across a few different cards. So I'm not sure if it's the board, the card or the IDE cable that I was using. So for now, I'm just going to replace the whole lot with this new micro SD to IDE board, along with new cards and a new cable. I'll take a look at that older solution at another time. Now these cards are generally quite good, but there is one annoyance, and that's the bare pins on the bottom. It's a shame there's not a plastic bracket for them or something like that. So for now I'm just going to use these plastic posts. And then I'll find a nice place to screw it into the case so it's nice and accessible, as well as being a bit neat. And with everything else done, I guess it's time to get the peripherals all hooked up. And as I've got 4 machines with 1 keyboard, monitor, speakers, and well, for the most part mouse, I needed some additional hardware to hook them all up. And with all that plugged in, it's time to boot it. And it posts, and shows up the 1GHz CPU and 384 MB of RAM. That doesn't seem right. Both sticks were labelled with 256, but it does look like one of them is actually a 128 MB stick instead. Well, for now let's continue into this nice and pretty in-depth BIOS, which is much nicer than that OEM board, which was very locked down with its set of options. Where this has pretty much everything that we need, though there isn't really much tweaking that needs to be done, as it has no onboard graphics or sound for me to disable. But what is a pretty good idea to do right now is to make sure it's detected that drive correctly, which we can do from this screen. And as we can see, I put a brand new 32GB card into the converter. I do have a 16GB card that's all set up and ready to go, but that's going to be set aside as a backup, because having an extra bit of space is always nice. So let's quickly go through the steps that you need to do to set up a card and get Windows 98 installed, which you can do from the CD, which is thankfully an auto booter. But from its menu we want to select to start the computer with CD support. We don't want to install it just yet. Next step is to use F-Disk. And one thing that I always do with a brand new card is to delete and then recreate the primary partition. This makes sure that everything is configured correctly, and then after a reboot we're ready to go on to the next step, which is to format the drive. Though oddly, the format command isn't on that fake A drive. So instead we have to find it in the Win98 folder on the CD. And due to its size, well, that will take a little while to run. But with that done, you can then run the next command that you will need to do with these cards, which is fdisk/mbr, as that will recreate the master boot record, which isn't always there by default on an SD or compact flash card, as well, normally they don't need it. My normal set of steps when I go to install the OS is to copy all the files to a folder on the drive, as I find it installs much faster from the drive than from the CD-ROM. And I've also found that some of the drivers also request the install media when they try to set themselves up, as it requires some files that are only found on that CD, but it's much easier just to point it to those files that are already on the drive. And with Xcopy complete, we should be prepped and ready to start installing Windows. Now this is a relatively simple process. Now I do tend to customize what I have on the machine, as I like to have all the games there as well as all the tools, but apart from that, well, you mostly just let it churn away for a bit. And after entering some of those personal details, we'll end up at the desktop, which you can see is pretty low color depth, as well as missing the audio, as we're going to have to install drivers for both of those. but thankfully we can sort that out pretty easily due to having that network card. And as it's an older ISA model, Windows actually has built-in drivers. So I can now just connect to my NAS, where I have a folder with all the drivers that I need. And after running a few setup programs and rebooting more than once, we now have a fast desktop that has boot sounds. And just look at this volume control. It's quite common for these drivers to come with their own custom controls, and quite often you got these very skeuomorphic designs. As the Voodoo cards don't have a setup program, you will have to manually install them from the device management panel. Thankfully, you just point it at the folder with the self-extracted files and away it will go. And before I call the setup of this computer done, there is something I need to do, and that is to change the background from this pure colour one. So let's pick that image from the Voodoo 2 drivers and perfect. As this is Goldfish on Games, what titles am I wanting to run on this machine? Well, here is a selection of games that I would like to play. First up is Deus-Ex, which can be played on the Pentium 4, but I'm a big fan of how it looks on those SLI Voodoo cards. Now it might be better with a later Voodoo 3 or 5, but it's still pretty great on this. The Liftech games are also a great fit for this machine, with No One Lives Forever flying on the hardware.
Damn. Hello. Bruno, how's France?
Are you deaf?
How dare you threaten me?
Oh, never mind.
Coward!
Would you like me to call out the targets for you?
That would be lovely.
And we also have a favourite of mine, Tron 2.0, which just looks so good. And it is a game that I've been meaning to review for quite some time now.
Huh? Oh, sure.
There are also a few other obscure games, as well this wouldn't be Goldfish on Games if there wasn't a few games that most people haven't heard of. Like Project Nomads, which has you going on an adventure on a flying island. It's an interesting title, but it is a little bit janky with its limited customizable controls. Or how about two other Dune games? With Frank Herbert's Dune, which I've never played but I have been interested in checking out what it's like. Oh! Or there's the last of the Dune RTS games, Emperor Battle for Dune, which I didn't really like back in the day, but I think it's time to give it another go and see how it holds up.
New construction options are now available. Construction started. Structure ready to place. Construction started.
So this machine is now complete, and for the most part running quite nicely. The power LED that we tried to hook up earlier, well, that just doesn't work, so I might have to look into another way to get it to come on. But it's not the end of the world. as is the RAM, which is definitely just 384 megabytes. Now that is more than enough for the games that I'm going to be running, so I'm not really too worried about it. But I did double check and both sticks both say that they are 256 megabytes. But they are from different makers, so it's possible that one of them is actually a match set that when combined gave you 256. Due to where this machine sits power wise, it won't get quite as much use as the Pentium 1 or the Pentium 4. But it does sit in a nice little niche that I do have plans for, so we will see it again. And until next time, I was the Goldfish, that is a computer that's back and ready to go, and this was Goldfish on Games. Thank you for watching my video, I do hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, you can let me know down in the comments, or you can use those buttons just below, you know the ones I mean. Or if you're not sure yet, then you can check out 2 other videos that I've done that are on the screen right now. So thank you again, and I hope to see you soon.